Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Evaggelos Vallianatos, former employee of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Dr. Vallianatos studied zoology and ancient Greek and medieval Greek history at the University of Illinois. He earned a PhD in European and Greek history from the University of Wisconsin and did postdoctoral studies in the history of science at Harvard. He has worked on Capitol Hill at the Office of Technology Assessment, and for 25 years, from 1979 to 2004, he worked as a program analyst at the Office of Pesticide Programs of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. He has taught as lecturer and visiting professor at several universities. He is the author of hundreds of articles and 7 books, including Poison Spring, The Secret History of Pollution and the EPA, and the Antikythera Mechanism, the story behind the genius of the Greek computer and its demise. As always, we will close the lecture with a questions and answer session. You can submit your questions at any time during or after the lecture by clicking the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. This will open another screen where you can type your questions. Those attending the event on Facebook can type their questions on the comments box on the left of the bottom of their screen. Dr. Vallianatos, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Konstantinos, and I want to thank you and Stefanos Sakellarides for this wonderful opportunity to speak about the US EPA and how it has developed in the last 50 years. This is a personal story for me, but it's also a tragic and a very important story for the whole of us, or for all the people of the United States and the world, because whatever EPA has been doing, it has the influence and influences most of the governments from throughout the world. As usual, I'm going to start with something that happened a long time ago, and I want to point out that Hippocrates, who is considered to be the father of medicine, he wrote a book 2,500 years ago called Airs, Waters, and Places, in which he united the environment and public health and human health. He spoke about the seasons, about the effects of the water, and the effects of winds and cold on our health, something that regrettably has yet to reach the doctors of the 21st century. Another great Greek doctor that lived in the 3rd century BCE, Erophilos, in a book called Reprimand, he said, if you lose your health, forget about everything else. You lose everything. You lose your mind, you lose your wealth, nothing makes sense anymore. And it's very much true to this very day. I started with World War I and the use of chemical warfare against each other. And thousands of soldiers lost their lives. And they used chemical compounds that unfortunately, years and years, probably 20 years later, were brought into agriculture in order to kill insects. Insects and human beings are the same thing to neurological agents. And one of the deadliest, the most persistent chemicals ever used was the chemical known as DDT. And the Americans were just simply crazy with this chemical. They use it for everything. They use it to supposedly control mosquitoes for malaria, to killing everything that moves. And look at this picture. I mean, it shows you how illiterate and ignorant the public health officials were not long ago. We're talking about the 40s, 50s, and 60s, up to 70s, until the US EPA, that was founded in December of 1970, banned this DDT from sale and use. In 1962, we had a wonderful woman named Rachel Carson. She used to work for the Department of the Interior, the Fish and Wildlife Service. And in that process, just like myself, she learned a lot about the environment, she learned a lot about wildlife and about chemicals, of course. So she wrote this fantastic book called Silent Spring. And if you haven't read it, I will still recommend it to read it. It's a wonderful book because she writes beautifully, and she spoke about the effects of these deadly chemicals on birds in particular. That's why the title of the book is called Silent. That is, a spring without birds is a silent spring. And she had a tremendous influence. In fact, some people argue that her book also contributed to the founding of the EPA in 1970. This is the EPA, this is the logo of EPA, and I argue, and I have been arguing for a long time, that EPA was really the greatest political invention of the 20th century. It came into being not because President Richard Nixon, a Republican, who founded it in 1970, he didn't do it just because suddenly he became an environmentalist, but he founded it because the situation in the United States before 1970 was really pretty bad. A river in Ohio caught fire. I mean, there was nothing. Everything was done. No one regulated anybody. Everybody, all the chemical industry and merchants and so on, they did anything they thought it was appropriate to do. And they did not really care about your health. So the EPA came into being, and for the first few years really did a wonderful job in not only banning DDT, but banning a lot of other DDT-like compounds. And it was a noble experiment that, unfortunately, in these days, it's having a rough time to survive. I joined the EPA in 1979, and it just happened that I joined the largest of the programs at the EPA. They used to call it Pesticides Office, Pesticides and Toxic Substances. And because I was a generalist, that is, I had science background, and I was a pretty good writer then, as I am today, I hope, they classified me as a program analyst. So in my particular position, I was in a division, and there were a whole branch of economists, another branch of biologists. So I was working directly for the deputy director of the division, and he asked me to, not to supervise, but at least to take a look at the written product of these economists and biologists. So I used to read what they did, and I was recommending changes in their style, in their ideas, and I tried in my own research to provide alternatives to their fixation on pesticides. If a pesticide didn't do well, replace it with another one. And I was always coming up with ideas, you don't need to rely on pesticides, you can do something different. And in this case, I may as well explain something about pesticides. Pesticides are synthetic chemicals, petroleum-based, that's why they call them petrochemicals. And what they do in order to confuse the people that are not really experts, they say they have something, they call it the active ingredient. And then the rest of the stuff, the rest of the chemicals, they call them inerts, if you can believe that. Inert is, the water is inert, does not hurt you. And yet they call other chemicals which were very toxic, they mix them up with the active ingredient, and the total product of that mixing was the stuff that the farmer uses when he sprays. But no one tests the final product. So as we speak right now, the stuff that gets into your food has never been tested. What they do test, and I will explain a little bit more about that, is the so-called active ingredient. So this is what's going on. So you have the active ingredients and the inerts. And this, by its own nature, nullifies anything about protection. Because, as I said, the final product, the mixture, is never tested by anybody. When you spray a chemical, and you spray it by a helicopter or an airplane, only 0.1% of the stuff ever gets to the insect, or to the weed, or to some other bug that you actually want to kill. 99% and more becomes airborne, and it circulates throughout the world. And it comes down when it rains, when it snows. That stuff, the rainwater and the snow have parts of that chemical. Now, you see people sometimes that they mix the chemicals before they actually use them. And from this picture, which comes from the early 80s from Iowa, you can see that these men do not exactly protect themselves. They probably don't know what they're doing. And one of the results, of course, of being relying on those so many chemicals, you have massive pollution. That is trash cans. What are you going to do with these cans that they used to be full of poisons? In the Carter administration, I started, as I said, 79, and I was working down to 2004. So I served in the administration of Jimmy Carter all the way down to George W. Bush at the end of his administration. I liked Jimmy Carter. He was a nice guy. He had good intentions. And indeed, his administration put together a very thick study and predicted pretty much what we're facing today with global warming. But regrettably, Jimmy Carter did nothing about the findings of the very study that they funded. So in the Washington Post area, you have the in the Washington, D.C. area, you have the Washington Post. And you can see in this cartoon, it tells the story, double barrel attack. I like cartoons because the cartoons usually, because they are cartoons, they can actually tell you the truth without fear or any kind of repercussions. And this was under the administration of Jimmy Carter. Under the administration of Jimmy Carter, who was a Democrat, we had tremendous number of new chemicals coming in, most of them very deadly to honeybees and other species of wildlife. And during the Carter administration also, a colleague of mine, Adrian Gross, he started in Canada, he got to the United States, he got a PhD in toxicology and statistics, and he started working for the US Drug Administration, and he was an inspector. So as part of his job was to go around to the laboratories and find out that they were doing the work as they were supposed to. And in one gigantic lab in Chicago, International Biotest Laboratory, he found out that the whole laboratory was making things up. They were creating numbers out of thin air. So a chemical company would pay them $100,000 to test chemical A, and they would, if it was the test for 22 months, they would do it for 8 months, and the rest of the months they would make up the numbers. And because his office and my office were next to each other, I came to know Adrian Gross pretty well. So sometime I said to him, Adrian, how did you discover that they were actually faking stuff? He said, look, when you work in a laboratory, you're not really that, you cannot be very careful. You drop drops of water on paper, you use different pens to write numbers and so on. But he said, when I went for the inspection and I asked them for some kind of a report, they gave me a piece of paper that had columns of numbers and names of animals and the doses and so on, but they were written very beautifully, very neat next to each other. And he said, the moment I took a look at that paper, I knew there was something wrong. So the next day he went out with a group of his colleague inspectors, and they discovered that each time, for instance, an animal, let's say a rat, developed a tumor, they would just discard the rat and put a new rat to replace the old rat. And eventually they discovered the whole laboratory was a sham. And by the way, it was so large laboratory that they had tested 40% of all chemicals used in the United States. You had local governments, you had the federal government, you had the Army, the Navy, all testing and paying money to this laboratory testing. And this laboratory did tremendously well. And they did it because they were making tremendous amount of money and they were not doing any work. And they didn't have any ethical standards, of course. They were criminals. So Adrian Gross, in 1984, said something in addition to what I already said that is really goes to the core of the argument why eventually the whole testing and the whole registration of those chemicals was simply meaningless. They brought him from the FDA to EPA in order to to teach the scientists within the pesticides office of EPA to be better and to catch any kind of illegality and so on. But instead, he said to me, what do you think I discovered? I discovered that my scientists, they never spent time to actually read the studies in front of them. Instead, they went straight to the conclusion of the study, and they were paraphrasing or cut and pasting the conclusion to become their own conclusion. So he called that a cut and paste science. So that you understand what I'm trying to suggest is that all the process of registration became meaningless because the very scientists that were working for the EPA decided to side with the industry and give them a clean bill of health. They did not want to appear that they proved that they would discover something that was a carcinogen, and therefore they couldn't use it, and therefore they might have been demoted or pushed around and so on and so on. So this is regrettably what was going on. When Reagan came to power, of course, things deteriorated sharply, if you can imagine that. And in this cartoon, what you have in front of you, you see the lady is Mrs. Gorsuch. She was the first administrator under Reagan. She was a lawyer from Colorado. And the name Gorsuch, by the way, she is the mother of the present Supreme Court Justice that, as we speak right now. I met her only once. The first thing she did when she got to be an EPA administrator was to fire all the lawyers responsible for enforcing the law. Now, a law is as good as its enforcement because it doesn't matter if you have a beautiful statement that we're going to protect clean water, but if you care less, if you don't do anything about protecting the water itself. So this is exactly what she did. And the administration of Reagan, of course, people began to learn. And they were reading the Washington Post, they saw these cartoons and so on. And it was terrible. I remember that. The vice president of Reagan, by the way, George Walker Bush, he spent 8 years going from agency to agency, from department to department, and say to them, look, if you spend $100,000 or more, I want to see what's your project? What are you trying to do? What are you trying to discover? And if he didn't like it, the project was gone. That's what George W's father, George Walker Bush, did. And in this cartoon, as you can see, the mother is almost frightening the little boy, her little son, not to breathe deeply. I mean, imagine that. And this cartoon tells the story. You can see the various departments. The Department of Defense is part of the Gun Manufacturers Association and so on. The Department of the Interior is part of the timber companies, and EPA, of course, is part of the chemical industry. This is what scholars call capture. You have the polluters, and they pay a lot of money to lobbyists who go to Congress, and they take the congressman to lunch, to dinner, so trips and so on. You know, I worked for a congressman from Maryland, and I remember we had a lobbyist every day coming in. I was not privy to what was going on, but definitely I saw these people coming into the office, and they did not come there just to say hello. They came there for favors, and I don't know what happened with the money, but they did have an impact. Some of the chemicals that I have been criticizing are the ones that they kill people or insects through asphyxiation. These are the nerve gases. And we used to have for several decades something called organophosphates. And now these have been replaced by neonicotinoids. They both come from Germany. And of course, in Germany, they have banned them. They don't use them, but we are still using them in the United States. Look at this slide. The spread of these chemicals from 1994 to 2000. It's extraordinary. And this slide shows the toxicity of the soil and the land. It has increased by 48% because of the intensive use of these neurotoxins. These are In my opinion, and I have put that down in my book clearly, no civilized society should be doing this sort of things. Monsanto, you probably know about Monsanto. It used to be one of the largest chemical and pesticide companies in the United States. Now it's a subsidiary of Bayer in Germany. But anyway, Monsanto came up with all sorts of chemicals, including the most popular chemical on earth. And I'm talking about glyphosate, which is supposed to be the prime ingredient, the key ingredient of Roundup. It makes billions of dollars per year. But the World Health Organization decided or concluded that that chemical is a carcinogen, and so does the state of California, and so does a number of other states, but EPA still says no, it's not a carcinogen. So go ahead and keep using glyphosate. So you can see the tremendous influence of this. In fact, I remember President Clinton, he would pick up the phone and call up people, prime ministers and others who had certain doubts about it, and they told them, no, everything's fine, we're using them, go ahead and use it. And this cartoon, of course, it's a kind of a funny cartoon, but it has a grain of truth in it that, the USDA, that is the US Department of Agriculture, it's abusing the farmers sometimes. They don't really support them in a sense by allowing all these chemicals to come in, promising all sorts of higher yields and so on. It deceives them because these chemicals they're not responsible for high yields. Indeed, I would argue it's the exact opposite. If you keep killing all the biological diversity in a farmer's field, what do you have? You have monoculture, and therefore you have the incidence of disease is growing faster, which means the farmer has to use more fungicides and so on and so on. So you're causing more trouble than good. And there's another interesting cartoon that the water itself has been contaminated and it's bound to be contaminated. If you go to the state of Iowa, you know that 96% of the land of Iowa is under cultivation. It's under cultivation, or they have dozens and dozens and dozens of gigantic animal farms. That's another huge story on its own. One of the greatest, and I know that for a fact. This one tells you the problems with hiring people from the industry to work for EPA and vice versa. This kind of revolving door, it would be the first thing I would do if I were the president for one day. Because if you have a person that works for a company for 20 years, and suddenly you bring this person to regulate the very industry from which he came, you're really joking. I mean, you're not serious. This person would not change his mind or her mind in order to do you a favor. And besides, the president who appoints the political appointees, he has an agenda. And the people at EPA are trying to please the president. So the revolving door facilitates that kind of ugly process and something that is inimical to public health and the environment. The only beneficiaries of whatever have been criticizing so far have been a few gigantic companies. And this cartoon pretty much reflects that. Big companies like Dow Chemical, and Monsanto, and so on, they're the people who make the money by selling the chemicals. They're not, now you and I are not benefit. In fact, the stuff like DDT or glyphosate or whatever, all that stuff gets into the food that you eat. So the only protection you have as a citizen is to eat organic food. Organic food, by definition and by law, is prohibited to use chemicals, that is synthetic chemicals, to use synthetic fertilizers, to use radiation or sludge. All the above are allowed in other, but not in organic food production. So that would be my strongest recommendation. And by the way, since I started working at EPA, I stopped eating conventional food. I have been eating organic food practically since the late 70s. And again, I repeat the same thing, that the sole beneficiaries of all this overuse, misuse of chemicals in agriculture have been these gigantic companies. And this cartoon, I got it from a Greek magazine called Nea Ekologia. I don't know whether the magazine exists or not, but this is where I got this from. And you have this deadly system. Let's say in this case, you have Acme, called the company Acme Chemicals, produces this stuff, then Acme cancer, whatever. And then you have Acme hospitals. So you have a kind of a circle of poison. One gives the poison, the other one promises to do something about it, and the other one puts you in a hospital. So this is not the way to do it. And the American Medical Association, the American doctors in general should be up in arms. They should be against it, and yet they don't. You go to a physician, let's say a private physician, he wants to take your blood and test it. And you say to the doctor, hey, what stuff are you want to test for? And he jots down in a piece of paper. And in fact, in my case, I asked the doctor the last time, I said to him, hey, what about chemicals? What about pesticides? He said, what? I said, pesticides. You get them by eating food. And he started laughing. These people are illiterate and, in my opinion, dangerous people if they don't know this basic stuff. And here is what you have in a kind of a greenhouse. You have the abusive use of this carcinogenic fungicides. And then you go ahead and use all these vegetables for your salad. And I got, this is a quotation from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I want to thank Constantine for suggesting this source, though I know I'm very well aware of the Union of Concerned Scientists. And as you can see, what it says is on numerous issues, ranging from mercury pollution to groundwater, contamination to climate change, political appointees of the George W. Bush administration have edited scientific documents, manipulated scientific assessments, and generally sought to undermine the science behind dozens of EPA regulations. It's a perfect little paragraph that fits every administration. And I guarantee you the same thing is going on right now under Biden. Trump, of course, was an extreme case of an abusive person who didn't give a damn about the environment. In fact, he refused to accept that there is infinite global warming. And he literally trusts EPA. But this picture tells you that Americans really are very much concerned about the EPA, and they don't want to trust EPA. In fact, in various polls, you have up to 70% of Americans that say they are very concerned about environmental protection and they want to protect the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, on climate change, EPA can do very little because, number one, the laws prohibit the agency from doing much about petroleum or natural gas or coal. They don't want them to deal with it. In fact, there is a case at the Supreme Court as we speak, in which they have been suing EPA not to do anything about coal. They want the stuff to be as it is. And again, as I repeated myself, and let me repeat myself again, that the EPA administrator does exactly what the president wants him or her to do. In other words, it's the White House that is running decisions at the EPA, not the EPA scientists. The EPA scientists, a person like me, I used to write memoranda. That's all I could do. I would write a memorandum, in which case I would make a case for or against something. And the person who read my memoranda may or may not have forwarded my conclusions to a higher up, and so on and so on. So the laws are as good as being enforced. And if the administrator or if the president does not want to regulate a certain industry, EPA is not going to do much about it. So the same thing about climate change. They can start a climate change, and they do, but they are not going to do much about trying to stop it. They can tell you the dangers of increasing CO2 and so on, but they're not going to deal with it. In 1988, 89, EPA sent me to teach at Humboldt State University in Northern California. And I enjoyed that very much. But as part of my teaching, I also focused on climate change. And After I returned, or rather when I was still there, I wrote an article, and the article appeared in the Chicago Tribune, a UN newspaper. And of course, in the article criticized severely the chemical industry, especially the petroleum companies. And when the op-ed appeared in 1989, nothing happened for 6 months until the Wall Street Journal picked up a couple of paragraphs from this article and reprinted them in bold letters. And immediately, the very day that reprint appeared, I found a letter of reprimand on my desk. A letter of reprimand is step number one before the firing. So I took the letter of reprimand and I went straight to the administrator's office. I knew the guy. He was a Republican, but I knew him. And he read the letter. He said, forget it. Just don't worry about it. So he spoke to somebody and they left me alone. But they intended to fire me because I was critical of the petroleum industry in 1989. So when you try to do something like this in a big bureaucracy, you're playing with fire, because they understand everybody has to be working together. In fact, several times, a couple of senior people said to me, "You're no longer a team player." I said, "Team player? Have you been reading my memoranda? You're telling me I'm not a team player?" But this is what they want: uniform opinion. They don't want to be critical of certain things. And of course, I didn't care about that, because I was doing research, I was interviewing people, and I had certain opinions, and I supported them by scientific evidence. So I was not about to be intimidated, but I paid a price for all that, by the way. At any rate, here is the unregulated pollution. It's a factory. Another one, and you can see in this one, in the graph, the sharp rise of CO2, especially going to here 2100. For hundreds of years, CO2 never went above 300 parts per million. And suddenly now, as we speak, it's 417 parts per million. And as you can see from this graph, it's projected to be far higher in a few decades. But unfortunately, we don't have many decades. In fact, I would say, unless we take care of climate in the next 10 years, we're going to be in deep, deep trouble, especially our children and grandchildren. You remember the Glasgow Climate Summit? It took place in early November of 2021. And the only person I really admire from all this conclave is Antonio Guterres, who is the Secretary General of the United Nations. He told the presidents and prime ministers of 200 countries to phase out fossil fuels by 2030, or they will be responsible, he said, for leading the natural world and civilization into a hellish future. And I'm quoting here, with a temperature above 2 degrees Celsius above the temperature of the pre-industrial age. And since this is a picture or cartoon that you can see the protests, there were protesters during the Glasgow meeting, but protesters don't seem to have much of an impact on prime ministers and presidents who visited. In 2020, again, Guterres again gave another little speech, and I quote him in this. It says, in 2020, climate shocks forced 30 million people to flee their homes, 3 times as many people that were displaced by war or violence. And further down, he said, we need a 45% reduction in global emissions by 2030 to reach carbon neutrality by mid-century. Yet, global emissions are set to increase by almost, I cannot say it, but anyway, to increase by 14%, I think, over the current decade. That spells catastrophe. Unfortunately, he's right. And because of what's happening now in Ukraine, this administration of Biden has probably forgotten about climate change, and they're focusing on Russia. That's it. So here is at least a picture painting of what the Earth must look like. And I remember Plato, reading Plato, he described the earth as a beautiful sphere. He said, and of course, Plato didn't have an airplane to go and see above the, but he imagined the earth as a sphere. He imagined it to be exquisitely beautiful, as most of the philosophers thought about the earth. And all this is happening, my dear friends, because of the metaphysics, that is the stuff that is in our mind about from our lives. We have been accustomed to this advertisement, better living through chemistry. And the results, of course, as we can conclude by now, are not really better. This cartoon is a little bit hilarious, but it has a grain of truth. Agriculture, this man in India says to the young man, tell me, what does agriculture mean? And the student says, it is 10% cultivation, 80% exploitation, and 10% agitation. Agriculture, you remember, it moved from the solar phase to the fossil fuel age. When I was growing up in Kefalonia, my father never had a tractor, never had anything except a mule and a wooden ox. I mean, and we had a donkey, of course, and we had this plow that we plowed the land, and we all worked with our hand. It was hard labor, but nevertheless, we did not use chemicals, we didn't pollute the environment or anything else, and we ate good food. Here is the modern version of the so-called industrialized farm. You can see as far as the eye can see, extremely long. I mean, they have wiped out all the borders, no fences between farms. I went to the Imperial Valley and I said, where am I? I got lost. It's just a huge territory. But unfortunately, this version is moving also into Greece. And here is an industrialized version of a vineyard. And this is my book. And I wrote the book in 2014. It came out in 2014. It took me a long time to write it. But I wrote it on the basis of government documents. That is, my colleagues, we used to have lunch together and so on. And we were talking, of course, about what we do every day. And they began to suspect that I was going to write something. So they brought their memoranda, their briefings, and slowly by the time I retired in 2004, I had a small library of these unpublished government documents. And it's on the basis of those government documents I wrote this book. And it's a kind of a warning. I mean, I study a number of things that I already spoke about, the regulation, about honeybees, about corruption, and so on. And it seems to me that we need to act and we need to do as much as we can, as quickly as we can, because EPA really needs to be rejuvenated. EPA needs to become an agency independent of the president, independent of Congress, and independent of the polluters, of course. So the model for that is the Supreme Court and the Federal Reserve. Those two institutions are independent. This is exactly what we need to do about the EPA. Not only that, but EPA has to have a gigantic laboratory that they ought to manage the chemical industry. If they have a study to be done, they would pay to have it done by EPA people. And by law, none of the industry people would have a right to even get near EPA. So the agency would be more or less like a bubble, and they would do their work without influence, and they would have their mind only to public health and the environment, because our lives depend on it, and of course the earth depends on it. We have alternatives. We have alternatives to producing food without chemicals. Either you use what my father used to do, or modern, you use the agroecological methods, like putting a strip of wheat, and the strips of buckwheat, they have these flowers that attract the very insects that would actually kill the aphids that bother the farmer. And here is a perfect example of agroecological situation where this cyprid insect kills the aphids that cause trouble. And this is a traditional farm in Oahu, Hawaii. And this is one in central Greece that I visited. And of course, this is a beautiful 17th century kind of diagram that shows you the family and the environment, and on the very top, the outside is where we have the constellations and in the form of animals. So it's a kind of a perfect vision of humans and nature working together. And this is my last slide, and this comes from the Greek tradition. And this one shows either god Dionysus or somebody moving among two trees and dancing. And with that, I want to thank you for listening, and I'll be delighted to answer to any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vallianatos, for the very, very interesting lecture. Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm listening.
Very good, very good. So we will go to the questions. Let me first ask quickly a question. If I understood it well, you said that Dr. Gross told you that the scientists working in his group, instead of scrutinizing the reports from the industry, they were cutting and pasting from the industry's reports in order to make their own report.
Exactly. The conclusion, they went to the concluding part of the report and they made the conclusion their own conclusion.
Okay.
That's the problem.
Why they were doing that? Because they were incompetent? They were lazy?
According to Adrian, in my discussions, no, these people were very competent. They had doctor's degree in various disciplines, especially toxicology. They were doing it because they did not want to reach conclusions that would differ from those of the company so that their product would be approved. That's
but that was their job. Somebody told them to do so, or it was their own decision?
You know, what usually happens is you have these data reports that are sometimes 1,000 pages. And you have to reproduce and you have to test that the mathematics is correct, the graphs make sense, and so on. And to read 1,000 pages takes a lot of time. So these people, in order to speed all these things up and to reach the proper conclusion, so they don't get in trouble, they went to the conclusion of the company's report and made it their own by cut and pasting the conclusion and putting it in their own conclusion.
Yeah, I find it very amazing.
Yeah, it's complete corrupt.
I'm a nuclear engineer at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Many of the people there, they were conscientious, so they were not doing that. But anyway, let me go to the first question. What is your position on genetic manipulation as Monsanto's on corn pest control?
Yeah. The whole genetic engineering started in the 90s. It started under the administration of Bill Clinton, I'm afraid to say. And indeed, they created a whole division of about close to 100 staff members to work on genetic engineering. And it seems to me, and then of course, they worked with the FDA, and FDA said, you know, if you have corn that has been modified, a corn that has not been modified, there is not much of any substantive difference between the two, which of course is wrong, because there's a tremendous difference between the modified and the non-modified. So they manipulated science in order to promote more control by corporations, because with the genetic engineering promotes the use of herbicides from the chemical company, so that you don't need to do anything else except spray the herbicide. That herbicide does not kill the crop that you are growing, but it will kill every weed that exists in the field. That's the reason why they allow this genetic engineering of crops like corn and soybeans and so on. And of course, there's a substantive difference between the two products. After you change the genetic nature of corn, you cannot say that that corn is identical with the corn that has not been manipulated.
Thank you. So let me just mention that this question came from Nikki Chichis. The next question is from KOS, course. I think it's just a part of the whole name. Thank you for an informative lecture, Dr. Vallianatos. I have been reading your articles in Counterpunch for years. What can we say as private citizens? What can we as private citizens do about climate? And also, what issues does the EPA face today? And he wants to ask what we can do as private citizens and what EPA is doing today about climate change.
Climate change is something that you can actually do by yourself. For instance, when I moved to California and I bought a house, the house I'm talking to you from, I immediately put solar panels on the house. We got rid of the old car. We have now an electric car. Now, these require money, of course, but it's a kind of a sacrifice we have to do to protect ourselves and to protect our society. Number two, you get involved with some environmental group and see that they are doing the right thing, or if you have the money, fund an environmental group that's actually lobbying on behalf of climate change. As far as EPA, what we need to do is to keep in touch with our congressmen and senators and tell them to support the EPA and to lessen the impact of the industry. And to, as I said, you have to be active and to really care about yourself. Stop eating non-organic food. Eat organic food so that your dollars go and support farmers who have spent the time and the effort to produce a healthy orange, a healthy carrot, or whatever else you eat. And I would also go a step further. Stop eating meat if you can, if you love meat so much, buy at least the meat that the animal has grazed. That is, they call grass-fed beef, grass-fed chickens or whatever. Do not eat conventional meat because it's loaded with chemicals and drugs, not just chemicals like pesticides, but drugs.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Savas Koksoglu. What is your opinion regarding organic versus non-organic vegetables and fruits?
Yeah, I already mentioned something about organic. The organic law prohibits the farmer from using synthetic chemicals, that is pesticides, and therefore the vegetables you buy are really good. I mean, if they have some poison, it will be a fraction of the amount of poison that will be in the conventional vegetables. So I have been eating organic food all my life. Oh, not all my life, but at least since the 70s. Yeah, they are very good for you, especially if you are a mother with a child, mother and child. In the early 70s, EPA scientists discovered that the milk of mothers, they had also been contaminated by these chemicals. So if you're a mother with a child, you need to know that your diet should be a good one, should be organic diet, so that your child can have healthy milk.
Thank you. The next question comes from Thanasis Konomou. Dr. Vallianatos, despite all the poisonous food we are eating, the average lifespan is constantly increasing. In short, people are living longer and longer. How do you explain that?
I have my doubts that this is a valid argument, that our life is expanding. There are a lot of people who are not dying at the age of 90. They died at the age of 40 and 50. We have hundreds of thousands. In fact, we have a cancer epidemic in this country and all over the world. We have neurotoxic disease that did not exist before the 70s. So there's tremendous adverse effects of all these things on human health. Therefore, there is no correlation between seeing a person who is 90 years old and continue to eat bad food. Some of us have the ability to detoxify stuff in the food than others. So yeah, I have seen people that are 90 years old and I have asked them, I said, what kind of food do you eat? And they said, we eat conventional food. So I'm astonished because I know what goes into the food. So I said, how can you do that? So I don't know. I'm not a medical doctor. But I said the best argument is that of Hippocrates. Still, the environment has a tremendous impact on us, and therefore we should respect and treat the environment with respect. In other words, don't use these chemicals and try to eat organic food.
The next question comes again from Nikki Chichis. You said that fossil fuels need to be eliminated. Since America only produces a very small percentage of coal, and since China produces 1/2 of the world's coal, how can we as Americans have any effect if we curb our 1 to 2% of fossil fuel production that we produce if China keeps on opening 11 new coal mines each week?
The most regretful of all these things that are going on right now is this war climate. The problems that the United States is having in Ukraine, the problems the United States is having with China. Climate change, in other words, the climate emergency that Guterres spoke about, demands that all these big boys, China, the US, Russia, India, they ought to get together and say, boys, come down with the fears of war and let's face our real enemy, which is climate. I know that China, I have been to China 3 times. China is using extensive amounts of coal, but they promised in the last United Nations agreement, they promised not to fund any more coal factories. And China is also thinking about ecological civilization, but it's a gigantic country. You're talking about 2 billion human beings. So they need to work with the United States. They need to go together. If you don't work together, there's nothing that's going to be done because the fears of these gentlemen are legitimate. I mean, India has 1 billion people. 1 billion people, yes, they don't pollute as much per capita, but 1 billion together pollute tremendous amount of pollution. So these countries have to work together, and they together have to plan a way to phase out the fossil fuels and replace them with solar and wind energy. Solar power, I have talked in Greece, for instance, 2 years ago, I said, look, you need to convert entirely to solar power. The country used to worship the sun. Rhodes had the Colossus of Rhodes was the statue, gigantic statue of God, son, Helios. So why can't we return back to some of our old traditions and begin to pay more attention to the natural world? In fact, the ancient Greeks used to worship the natural world. You could not just dump your stuff into the river. The river was a god. We need to think philosophically about this because it's a deadly problem, especially for our sons and grandsons and granddaughters, of course.
Yeah, I just would like to make a comment here that it's not only 1 to 2% that the Americans add to the carbon dioxide. Is much higher than that. Actually, before China was industrialized, America was the biggest polluter, and which went on for a very, very long time. Now China is on the top, but next to the top is the United States still. Mm-hmm. So the next question comes from Thanasis Economou. Also, the people who make all the regulation at EPA are eating the same food as anyone else. Are they not concerned about the regulations?
This is a very interesting, it's a kind of a philosophical question because you would think with all the education that they have and knowing what I learned by being there, they would never eat what conventional food is all about. But some people do, because some people are very stubborn and they think of money and they think of the sort of conventional wisdom that the more synthetic chemicals, the better, the larger the farmer, the better, and so on and so on. And they themselves need to be educated. If you can be a top scientist, but if you have very little ethical standards, you can create a nuclear bomb, right? Of course. So we need to come back. We need to come back to some principles and traditions that are extremely ancient, like the 2 sources I cited with Hippocrates. We need to take care of our environment because the natural world is life. We cannot survive without the natural world. I mean, we cannot. The air comes from trees. We cannot start cutting down trees. I mean, we had a gigantic wind 2 weeks ago, and it pulled apart gigantic trees that were 100 years old. It just pulled them down completely. Now, suppose this thing happened and there was also a huge rain. What would be on the path of the wind? I mean, do we need to wait until the wind blows down skyscrapers before we do something about climate change? Just to me, it's unbelievable, because to me, the natural world is life. I cannot conceive myself of being alive without healthy trees, healthy food, healthy birds, butterflies, honeybees, and so on.
The next question comes from Timmy Papas. Do the Western countries have a greater responsibility for climate change?
Do what?
The Western countries have a greater responsibility for climate change.
Yes, they do, because in Europe, they're moving into the direction of wind and solar power. And there are a lot of very well-educated and good Europeans that they want to do something about it. We need to work together, Americans and Europeans and Chinese and Indians together. We need to forget for a second that we are white or black or green or yellow. We need to work together, because this is a global issue. There is nothing more significant than working together than this climate change. It's a deadly threat, and it does not affect only white people or black people. We have to work together, rich and poor and all this. So all the billionaires, instead of keeping their billions into a Swiss account, they ought to use them to protect us. They ought to use them in order to protect us, protect themselves. I mean, we need a radical change. We need almost a revolution to actually change the human mind, to come to the point to respect and to love nature just like they love themselves.
Yeah, I would like just to make the comment here that many of the developing countries, they make the argument that the developed countries, they polluted the planet for a very, very long time. And now that they try and they develop themselves, but now the developing world, when they try to develop themselves, then the developed world complains about the use of fossil fuels. So definitely there is a responsibility here. Okay, the next question comes also from Timmy Papas. What do you think about Greece's new alliance with Cyprus and Israel to develop oil exploration with our offshore regimes?
I mean, I'm against the development of any petroleum, any oil, or any fossil fuel. This may be a temporary measure, and it's a small percent compared to what's happening in India or the United States and so on. But I would think that Israel, with the Israelis are tremendously intelligent people, just like the Greeks and so on. They ought to work together on alternatives. And since they live in a climate that is extremely vulnerable to this temperature, rising temperature, I would think they would be extremely intelligent also to face this danger. So Israel and Cyprus and Greece, even Turkey, they ought to stop all these machinations and focus on facing the real enemy, which is rising sea levels, higher temperatures, drought, intensive winds, storms, unexpected heavy rains, unexpected destruction from this changing temperature of the planet.
Okay, I don't see any other question. Stefan, do you see any other question?
No, but I think one question just came up from Sarnassis.
Oh, okay, I do not see it. Oh, okay, yes. Energy demand is very high now and will be higher in the future. In your opinion, can the nuclear energy play any part in solving this potential problem in the future, and could also be a factor in improving our environment?
I'm very sorry, can you please repeat that question?
Yes, energy demand is very high now and will be higher in the future. In your opinion, can the nuclear energy play any part in solving this potential in the future?
Okay, there's not
improving our environment.
Yeah, there's no doubt that we need more energy. I mean, we have almost 8 billion people. Demands for energy will continue to increase. So nuclear power might be tolerable for some time, but remember, if you have a nuclear power plant, that is an ember for a nuclear weapon. Those two things are related. So eventually we need to get rid of all this nuclear power plant and nuclear weapons and so on. So the focus, in my opinion, is the sun, S-U-N. It's infinite amount of energy. We use only a tiny fraction of it. If I were the president, I would use money to put solar panels on every roof of every house all over the world. And then use the tremendous power that comes, the medicine that comes out of wind, and out of other sources of green energy before we rely, and we should definitely get rid of the fossil fuel. To me, I have been with this subject for many, many years, so doesn't make me wise, but it gives me some kind of understanding of why we need to move fast, because I agree with Guterres. The next 10 years are the key 10 years for humanity. If we don't do that and we allow the temperature to rise above 1.5 degrees centigrade, then Celsius, then we're going to be in deep trouble. And it may be, some climatologists say, sometimes we may not be able to reverse the course. So we have 10 years. We need to do something personal, and we need to do something by convincing our government to get out of this war mentality and focus on ecological issues in the environment, because that's the life and death for hundreds of millions of young men and women and children and grandchildren, and they rely on us. We don't want to go away, because I may be alive for another 10 years, I don't know, the most, probably. But then what about my son and daughter? What about my grandchildren? I have 3 grandchildren. I think about them, and therefore anything I do is focused on that. So I hope civilization relies on this kind of common understanding of what is important.
Okay, I don't see any other question. Then I would like to get the opportunity to ask another question myself. And before that, I would like to say that even if today we are getting lots of power from solar and wind, we have not solved the problem of storage, because when there is no sun and there is no wind, we are not going to have solar power or wind power. So we have to store it, but the storage problem has not been solved at this point. So the whole problem is very complicated. It's not only to produce as much as you can, but also how can you store it and use it when you cannot use it online, namely when the sun is not there and the wind is not there. So there are still lots of technological problems to be resolved. So the question that I would like to ask, is there any agency that tests on a regular basis for pesticides and herbicides the food that we eat, which is produced in the US or is imported from Mexico, Chile, other South American countries, China, Vietnam, and all over the world? So is an agency that tests the food that comes into this country and the one that we produce here on a regular basis?
Yes, it's the USDA and the Federal Drug Administration.
Okay.
The US Federal Drug Administration and USDA regularly check on the food that we eat. And they compare sometimes the conventional with non-conventional. And they have, when they register or they approve a chemical, they say this chemical should not be more than 5 parts per million in bananas, for instance. But the 5 part is decided not by science, it's decided by the person who has the banana field. I mean, it's completely illogical, and it's not really based on science. But yes, they can call up FDA, Food and Drug Administration, and USDA, and find out that within those gigantic organizations, who is doing the testing. And I'm sure on the internet, they're going to be able to find the results of testing of the food that we eat.
Okay, and then a new question came up. What do you think about the new developments in energy supported by fusion power?
By what?
Fusion power.
Fusion?
Mm.
I I'm not a physicist. I don't really understand what fusion power is all
I think this is Stephanos. I think she refers to nuclear fusion, which is basically the joining of the two nuclei of hydrogen. Costas can explain.
Yeah, the issue with the fusion power is that even if it become at this point is not at the stage that you can produce power from fusion reactors. Maybe it may come up, it may happen in the next 50 years or something. We don't know. So far, the latest experiments that they have been done, they can produce sustainably energy from fusion power for about 5 seconds. So we are not at the point that we can say that we can produce power for our needs from power at this time. So
Does that include the most recent experiment that was reported last week?
That it was reported, they made 59, if I remember well, 59 kilowatt hours in for 5 seconds. They could sustain it for 5 seconds. So there is lots of work still to be done.
So, Costas, I didn't see any questions on Facebook, but since as a panelist, I cannot submit a Q&A, so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions too.
Okay, go ahead.
My first question to Evaggelos is, you showed us the famous plots that Al Gore had also used, which shows the CO2 in the atmosphere being stable since the year 0.
That's right.
So my question is, how did people measure it back then? Because I understand a measurement that we could probably measure it in year 1900, but how could we measure it throughout antiquity and the Middle Ages?
The only thing I know about that is that for several hundred years, I don't know whether it's year 0, but for several hundred years, the parts per million of CO2 were about 300. And
How do you know that?
Since the Industrial Revolution, from 300, it has become 417.
But how do we know? That's my exact question. How do we know that it was 300?
How do we know? They know by going into the ice, they make the ice cores, and they go back to thousands of years and they check the ice ring and they find out exactly the amount of CO2 that was trapped.
That's right, I remember now.
Yeah. And now, because of the Industrial Revolution and the continued use of burning of fossil fuels, we have this tremendous amount of CO2. By the way, the very fossil fuel industry, for instance, the scientists that used to work for Exxon, in 1970s, they had internal, we know they had evidence that the temperature of the earth was increasing because of the burn of fossil fuels. And they wrote memoranda to their bosses saying, look, we have discovered this and this is going to be hazardous for our continuing existence. And of course, all that was covered up and they continue. And how do I know that? Because somebody sued ExxonMobil on all these memoranda, all this, yeah, that's right, the emails came into light. So this chemical industry, this fossil fuel industry, they know that they are working and they're promoting something that is hazardous for the human, for human existence, and yet they continue to do so, and they continue to profit from it. And we have a situation right now in the United States that most of the politicians who are Republican in Congress say there is no global warming. They deny climate change. To me, that is almost a crime. They deny science. They deny the science of the last 50 years. And if you ignore science, then you go back to dark ages. This is the kind of problems we face in this country. And we are divided as a country. And of course, now we have this sudden burst of military activity in Eastern Europe. And now all the efforts of the country are focusing on the Ukraine rather than focusing on trying to convince 2 senators, the woman from Nevada, Arizona, and the man from West Virginia, to vote with the other Democrats to pass that gigantic bill to spend $550 billion on global warming, on preventing global warming. So that's the problem we have. And
My second question is, what is the European equivalent of EPA, and was that a more rigorous tool in controlling the industry in Europe, at least? And the same applies to the rest of the world. If EPA was giving a free rein to the American chemical industry, what was the European response to that with the corresponding agency?
Yeah, each country in Europe has its own EPA type of organization, including Greece. And of course, the European Union, as a European Union, they have the Commission, and within the Commission, they are funding scientists to do testing and so on and so on. And the European Union as a whole, I think they are more serious about environmental protection than we are in this country. But they are themselves trapped in this global military tension because most of the countries are part of NATO. NATO now as a force, a military force, including Greece, they are now supporting the United States in the Ukraine, and they have abandoned any thought about climate change. And that is the real tragedy. In other words, we need to get out of war and fight a war against climate, not a war against other people. That's my opinion. I mean, and it's a shame. It is really a shame because both the United States and Europe have thousands and thousands of wonderful scientists who know, and they have been writing and publishing and talking about climate change for decades. And the United Nations have this wonderful international organization that they publish a report every year. And they are warning us. And as you heard my quoting from the Secretary General, you are going to create a hellish future if you do not reduce the fossil fuel emissions by 50% at least by 2030. That is, we only have about 8 years left for this. So this is what the priorities ought to be, not just of the United States, but of the whole world. Stop war and fight war against climate change.
And final question I had was, despite EPA's deficiencies and sins, from what I understand, we have managed as a country to clean up our act considerably since the 50s, let's say. For example, in Los Angeles, from what I understand, the pollution is much less than it used to be decades ago, when you could barely breathe and see for a few feet away on bad days. And the same in London, and also like in areas like Ohio and Pennsylvania, there were particular areas where the air was absolutely stinky. You couldn't drive through that place. So what is your response to that?
You're right. I mean, overall, this country has benefited despite the deficiencies of EPA, despite the efforts of the Republicans in particular to cripple the agency. The agency has done enough of a good work. And we, in the 70s, they managed to pass those wonderful laws of Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act that protects the natural world. The problems I described are problems that affect, to some degree, a real protection. And that is not a small amount. But in general, we have definitely benefited. I mean, the regulation of the automobiles, for instance, the cars that you drive today produce less toxic stuff coming out of the pipe than they were 20 or 30 years ago. When I moved to where I am right now in Southern California, they used to tell me the pollution of the automobiles was particularly so heavy, they could not see the mountains around the small town that I live. Now we can see clearly the mountains. And in fact, I walk up to the mountains and it's much better. I mean, the air is all much better, but nevertheless, the cars are becoming larger, they're becoming more, and it's just a horrendous situation. I never drive, of course, anywhere. Now I take the train. If I want to go to LA, I take the train. It takes me an hour to go to LA. by train. And so there's a lot of things to be done, but nevertheless, we should be grateful that we passed the laws that we did in the 70s and that we have something called the Environmental Protection Agency.
Thank you.
Another question from Nikki Chichis. Was there not a rise in temperature in the earlier times like antiquity?
Please repeat that question.
Was there not a rise in temperature in the earlier times like antiquity? She wants to say, was a time in the past that the temperatures, they had gone up too?
Yeah, we have the geological record shows that in some centuries, 14th century, 18th century, we have intense periods of heat, of freezing, so we have the ice age and so on. But there is something straightforward after the 18th century, that is after the Industrial Revolution, something like the CO2 went like this, straight up, because of the human intervention, that is the anthropogenic effects on the natural world. There's no doubt about that. So you cannot argue just because in the year 5000 BCE, you might have volcanoes and they somehow cooled off the temperature, that this is a pattern that is going to be repeated. Therefore, we continue business as usual. You cannot argue like that. That's not true. So what the climatologists are telling us that since the Industrial Revolution, humans have become a big factor in the regulation of planet Earth. In fact, we have become such a gigantic factor where they are threatening the gigantic planet of Earth. We, the puny humans, have the power with science and technology to destroy this wonderful, beautiful planet. So we need to be respectful and philosophical about that. And like the ancient Greeks and like the ancient Egyptians and Babylonians, we should love our mother. The Native Americans keep calling the earth Mother Earth, and so did the Greeks, by the way. So the earth is really our mother. That's the main conclusion of everything I have said, and we can actually think. We should not hurt our mother. Mother Earth, that's right, the trees, the birds, everything, the flowers, they are all our life. And we don't want to have a child growing up to breathe carcinogens. That's something, to me, it's barbarous. It's only barbarians can do this sort of thing.
It is my understanding from a lecture that we had on the climate change about 2 or 3 years ago, that definitely, if you go back in the record, in the scale of millions of years, there were times where the climate was much warmer than it's today. But the changes, they were taking place in a very, very slow rate. And what happens now, it happens because of the anthropogenic effects. It goes up very fast. Whatever was happening in the past, it was happening in the scale of millions of years, not in the scale of 100 years or 50 years or something like that. So the difference is that now it goes up very fast because of the anthropogenic effects.
I agree.
Okay, so I think that, let me see, any other question? I don't see any other question. So thank you very, very much, Dr. Vallianatos, and that was a very interesting lecture. So we close the lecture here. So Stefanos, please close the session. And Dr. Vallianatos, please stay for a little while, and we will come back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I hope that something beneficial comes out of all this. Thank you.